So let us now study the anatomy and physiology of our nervous system. Alright, so our nervous system is divided into, I'm sure you're familiar with this. So we have the central nervous system or CNS. Alright, the central nervous system is composed of our brain and the spinal cord. And we have the peripheral nervous system or PNS, which is composed of the peripheral nerves that connects the CNS to the rest of the body. So our nervous system provides sensory, integrative, and motor functions to the body. And to put it simply, the nervous system coordinates other bodily functions. So yun ang ibig sabihin ng integrative. So in a way, it coordinates other bodily functions, whether it be motor or sensory. The motor functions of our nervous system can be divided into the consciously controlled somatic nervous system and the unconscious controlled autonomic nervous system. So that's our nervous system. So again, in this diagram, our nervous system is composed of the CNS or the central nervous system, which is composed of our brain and the spinal cord. And we have the peripheral nervous system, which is composed of the network of nerves. Alright, so under that, we have the sensory nerves and the motor nerves. So under the motor nervous system, as I mentioned earlier, we have the controlled somatic nervous system and the uncontrolled autonomic nervous system. So we will go into the details first of the central nervous system. Okay, so here is an illustration showing our central nervous system. Again, that is composed of our brain and the spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system, which is composed of the network of nerves. So under this peripheral nervous system, for the network of nerves, we have the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. And like what I mentioned earlier, the peripheral nervous system is composed of the sensory nerves, alright, that is somewhat connected to our sense organs. And we have the motor nerves. So it has something to do with the muscles. Now, under the motor nerves, we have the controlled somatic nervous system. Alright, so controlled meaning the contraction of these muscles can be regulated or controlled by the will, like the skeletal muscles. And the uncontrolled autonomic nervous system, in which the contraction of the muscles are uncontrolled or it is not under conscious control, like the smooth muscles and the cardiac muscles. So that's the divisions of our nervous system. Alright, so again, this is our central nervous system composed of our brain and the spinal cord. Alright, and the basic unit of our nervous system is the neuron. I'm sure you're all aware of this, no? The neuron. The neuron is the basic unit of the nervous system. And here is an illustration of a typical neuron. So a typical neuron is composed of the following. We have the cell body, and surrounding the cell body are branches called dendrites. The cell body contains the nucleus and the organelles. So I'm sure you're aware of the basic parts of the cell, but what makes this special is that the cell body has branches or dendrites. These dendrites, they receive nerve impulses, no, and delivers it to the cell body. Then there is a long part of the cell body, or you can call it an extension, called the axon. The axon basically carries the nerve impulses away from the cell body. And the axon is composed of specialized cells called Schwann cells. In between Schwann cells is a gap called the node of Ranvier. And the entire axon is surrounded by a myelin sheath. The myelin sheath acts like an insulator, no, for the passage of nerve impulses. And the axon terminates in the so-called axon terminal. Alright, each of those terminals, they are composed of neurotransmitters. Okay, so those are the basic parts of a typical neuron. Alright, so again, you have here the cell body. The cell body contains the nucleus and the other organelles that are usually present in a cell. But what makes the cell body special is because there are branches or extensions of the cell body, short extensions or branches called dendrites. These dendrites, they receive nerve impulses and delivers it to the cell body. And there is a long structure which is called the axon. The axon delivers the nerve impulses away from the cell body. So the axon is composed of special cells called Schwann cells, and in between Schwann cells is the node of Ranvier, and the entire axon is covered by a myelin sheath. Alright, the axon terminates in the axon terminal, which carries the neurotransmitters. Okay, so we have here an animation showing the dendrites receiving nerve impulses and delivering it to the cell body. Then here is the axon. The axon delivers the impulses away from the cell body. Alright. Okay, so those are the basic parts of a neuron. Alright, so let's have a quick review of the different parts of a neuron. So again, we have the cell body. The cell body contains the nucleus and the organelles that's present in a typical cell. Then the cell body or the cyton has many branches called dendrites. Okay, dendrites are cell branches that receive impulses and delivers it to the cell body or the cyton, or sometimes we call this soma. Then there is a long branch called the axon. The axon is a branch of the cell or the cyton that transmits impulses away from the cell body or the cyton. Okay, so those are the basic parts of a neuron, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this. Alright, so let us now proceed with the classification of neurons. Now, neurons can be classified or can be grouped in two ways. Number one, neurons can be grouped on the basis of structural differences. So we have what we call bipolar neurons, unipolar neurons, and multipolar neurons. Alright, that is on the basis of structural differences. Now, the way we look at it through the microscope. Then another basis for grouping neurons is by functional differences. No? So we have sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. So we will differentiate these three types of neurons according to their functional differences in a little while. Alright, so let us now differentiate the neurons based on their structural differences. Alright, so we have unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar. Alright, so what we have here is an illustration showing the three types of neurons according to their structural differences. Ayan, no? So we have bipolar. Alright, everybody, can you take a look at the appearance of a bipolar neuron? And we have a multipolar neuron and a unipolar neuron. So let's describe now a bipolar neuron. So bipolar neurons, by definition, they are found in the eyes, nose, and ears. So take note that they are found in the eyes, nose, and ears, and have a single axon and a single dendrite extending from opposite sides of the cell body, as you could see in this illustration. So you have a single axon and a single dendrite located in opposite directions or opposite sides of the cell body. Ayan, ito ito, no? So this is a bipolar neuron. So you have a single axon at one end and a single dendrite at the opposite end of the cell body. Okay, so that's a bipolar, no? Bi meaning two. So dalawa yung ano niya, no? Dalawa yung structures that are attached to the cell body. We have one axon and one dendrite. Alright, and you can find this in our nose, ears, and eyes. So that's how we describe bipolar neurons. Alright, next we have unipolar. So unipolar neurons are found in the ganglia outside of the central nervous system. Alright, and have an axon and a dendrite arising from a single short fiber extending from the cell body. Okay, so take note of this, class. So you have an axon and a dendrite arising from a single short fiber extending from the cell body. Alright, everybody, can you take a look at this? So here is the appearance of a unipolar neuron. So you have here the cell body. There is one short extension here arising from the cell body. So nakikita nyo to, no? Then from here will arise the dendrite and the axon, no? From that single short extension na yan, no? Okay, single short fiber extending from the cell body. So from there, ito yung single short fiber extending from the cell body. Ito yung single short fiber. Then from here will arise an axon and a dendrite. So that's how we describe a unipolar neuron. Uni kasi there is only one short fiber extending from the cell body, and from that single short fiber will arise an axon and a dendrite. Kaya unipolar siya. In contrast to bipolar, ito yung soma or yung cell body. So from the cell body will arise one axon and one dendrite, no, at opposite sides. Bi, dalawa. Ito, there is one single short fiber. And from there will arise one axon and one dendrite. So that's what we call unipolar. Alright, unipolar neurons again are found in the ganglia outside of the central nervous system. Alright, and lastly we have multipolar neurons. Multipolar neurons have many nerve fibers arising from their cell bodies and are commonly found in the brain and the spinal cord. So again, can you take a look at this illustration of a multipolar neuron? So you have here the cell body, and from that cell body will arise many branches or dendrites. So that's why I mentioned in this PowerPoint slide, they have many nerve fibers arising from their cell bodies. Okay, so maraming nerve fibers, no? Maraming dendrites, no? As you could see in this illustration of a multipolar neuron. So you have many dendrites or many nerve fibers arising from the cell body. So may axon pero marami siyang dendrites, no, surrounding the cell body. And you can find the multipolar neurons in our brain and spinal cord. Alright, so those are our multipolar neurons. They have many nerve fibers or dendrites arising from their cell bodies. And again, you can find multipolar neurons in our brain and spinal cord. So let's move on. Alright, so what about the classification of neurons according to their functional differences? Kasi yung ginawa natin kanina, we classified neurons based on their structural differences as seen through the microscope, yung appearance nila. Alright, ito naman, we will group the neurons or we will classify neurons based on their functional differences. So, tatlo yan, no? We have sensory neurons, we have interneurons, and motor neurons. Okay, so what are sensory neurons? Sensory neurons or afferent neurons, they conduct impulses from the peripheral receptors to the central nervous system. So yung peripheral receptors, ito yung mga sense organs natin, no? Like the eyes, the ears, nose, yung tongue with the taste buds. Ayan, no? So they conduct impulses from these receptors, yung mga sense organs, to the central nervous system. Ayan, so those are sensory neurons, no? And they are usually unipolar, although there are some that are bipolar. Pero most of them are unipolar neurons. Okay, so those are sensory neurons. So again, in terms of function to, no? They conduct impulses from the sense organs to the central nervous system. Then we have the interneurons. No? The interneurons are mostly multipolar neurons. So yung multipolar, yung maraming nerve fibers or dendrites surrounding the cell body. No? And they are located within the central nervous system. No? Like our brain. No? Our brain is composed mostly of interneurons. Mga interneurons yan. So they form links, no, between other neurons. And they are mostly multipolar. Alright, like the neurons that are found in our brain. Okay, and lastly, we have the motor neurons. Motor neurons are mostly multipolar neurons, and in terms of function, they conduct impulses from the CNS to the effectors. Yung effectors, yung mga muscles natin, which is opposite to the sensory, kasi yung sensory neurons, they conduct impulses from the sense organs to the CNS. Ito naman yung mga motor neurons, they conduct impulses from the CNS to the muscles or to the effectors. Alright, so that's how we group these neurons according to their functional differences. Okay, in terms of structural differences, we have unipolar. Alam niyo na yung itsura ng unipolar, ha? So you have a cell body, tapos may short na extension or fiber. Then from there will arise one dendrite and one axon. Alright, yung bipolar naman, you have a cell body. Then from there you have one axon at one end and a dendrite at the opposite end of the cell body. And lastly, we have the multipolar neurons, wherein there are many branches or nerve fibers surrounding the cell body. Alright, and in terms of function, we have sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. Alright, so I hope everything is clear about the classification of these neurons. So ito, no, bipolar. Ayan, so at one end, you have an axon, and at the opposite end of the cell, you have a dendrite. Ito naman, unipolar, there is one short nerve fiber, or ito, one short nerve fiber. Then from there, mag-a-arise siya into an axon and a dendrite. And ito naman yung multipolar. Multipolar neurons. The cell body has several branches or mga nerve branches arising from the cell body. Okay, so let's talk about now the synapse. So I'm sure you are aware with what the synapse is. No, the synapse is the gap between neurons, right? And nerve impulses must travel from this gap, from one neuron to another neuron. Okay, may space, no, between neurons, and we call that the synapse. So the junction between two communicating neurons, or the gap between two neurons, is called a synapse. No, meron siyang synaptic cleft, or may space, no, between them, across which the impulse must be conveyed. Everybody, can you take a look at this illustration? So we have here the axon terminal, diba? So ito yung axon terminal. Then once the nerve impulses reaches the axon terminal, the synaptic vessels will release neurotransmitters. Yan, sa mga vesicles nila. So they will release neurotransmitters via exocytosis. Then these neurotransmitters will travel through that synaptic cleft or synaptic gap. Then they will be picked up by receptors, neurotransmitter receptors that will receive these neurotransmitters and will trigger an electrical impulse that will travel to the next neuron. Okay, so that's how the synapse works. So again, we have here an axon terminal. Once the electrical impulses reaches the axon terminal, the synaptic vesicles will release their neurotransmitters via exocytosis. As you can see here, nag-release sila ng mga neurotransmitters via exocytosis. Then these neurotransmitters, they have to travel through this synaptic gap or synaptic cleft, which they will be picked up by receptors of the other neuron. Ito yung mga neurotransmitter receptors. Once these receptors receive the neurotransmitters, they will trigger the generation of an electrical impulse that will travel to the next neuron. So, ang travel ng electrical impulses ay parang ganito. So, electrical, then chemical, then electrical ulit. So, ganun siya. Alright? So, electrical, pagdating sa axon terminal at pag nag-release siya ng neurotransmitter, chemical na yung magta-travel across the synaptic cleft. Then, pag na-receive na ng mga neurotransmitter receptors, electrical ulit yan. Okay? So, that's how nerve impulses travel from one neuron to the next neuron. So let us now differentiate between white matter and gray matter. Okay, so this will depend kung ano yan, kung brain or spinal cord yung location. Okay, pag sinabi natin kasing white matter, this is composed of bundles of axon. So, white matter is composed of bundles of axons, each coated with a sheet of myelin. So, yun ang yun ang ating concept of white matter. Kasi kita to sa brain and spinal cord. Pag sinabi nating white matter, mga axons yan. Pag sinabi nating gray matter, ano yan? Cell bodies and dendrites. So, gray matter is composed of masses of cell bodies and dendrites, each covered with synapses. So, this is again gray matter. Gray matter is composed of dendrites and cell bodies, while the white matter is composed of bundles of axon covered with myelin sheath. So, ang ano ngayon natin is yung location nila, no? So, it will depend on whether it is the brain or the spinal cord. Now, in the spinal cord, the white matter is at the surface, alright, or nasa outer rim, while the gray matter is inside. Alright, so sa brain naman, the white matter is inside, the gray matter is on the surface. Okay, let's talk about first the spinal cord, because the white matter is at the surface, the gray matter is inside. Alright, everybody kindly take a look at the spinal cord. So, yung gray matter sa spinal cord natin is inside, nasa loob siya yung gray matter. Ito, yung parang letter H, no? Alright, this is the gray matter, while yung white matter is on the outer rim, nasa outer, no? So ito yung white matter, no? Nasa outer surface, yan. Okay, the white matter is at the surface. So, and the gray matter is inside, nasa spinal cord. Ayan, the gray matter is inside, while the white matter is on at the surface. Yan, dito na. So, ayan yung spinal cord. Okay, ito din sa spinal cord, the gray matter is inside while the white matter is on the surface or at the surface. The white matter is composed of bundles of axon while yung gray matter is composed of dendrites and cell bodies. Alright, what about the brain? So, sa brain natin, the white matter is inside, the gray matter is at the surface. Alright, so ito yung brain natin, no? Ayan, so here is a cross-section of our brain. So you will notice that the white matter is inside, no? Nasa loob siya, while the gray matter is at the surface. Ito yung gray matter. Ayan, no? Nasa outer or nasa surface siya. Yung white matter nasa loob. Ayan, no? Alright, so everybody look at the cross-section of our brain. Sa spinal cord, baliktad. Yung gray matter yung nasa loob. Okay, while yung white matter yung nasa outside. Sa brain, hindi. Yung gray matter yung nasa outside, yung white matter yung nasa loob. Alright, so that's the location of the gray matter and white matter in terms of the spinal cord and the brain. So again, for the spinal cord, the gray matter is inside while the white matter is outside. For our brain, the white matter is inside, the gray matter is outside. Okay, however, the brains of lower vertebrates like fishes and amphibians, they have their white matter on the outside of their brains as well as their spinal cord. So pareho no, sa mga lower fishes na walang pinagkaiba. Yung white matter nasa outside, yung gray matter nasa loob. No? For both their brain and their spinal cord. Sa mga lower vertebrates like fishes and amphibians. Ayan, very important to ha, yung location ng white matter, gray matter, and kung ano yan, no? Pag sinabing white matter, those are bundles of axons. Yung gray matter is composed of dendrites and cell bodies. Ayan, no? Okay, so let's talk about now the meninges, no? I'm sure you are aware of this. Yung mga meninges, these are membranes covering our brain. Alright, so these are coverings, no, or membranes ng ating spinal cord and brain. So both the spinal cord and brain are covered in 3 continuous sheets of connective tissue called the meninges. Alright, so from outside in, paloob tayo, no? We have the following. Dura mater. The dura mater is pressed against the bony surface of the skull or the cranium. Alright, then below the dura mater is yung arachnoid. Then below the arachnoid is the pia mater. Okay, so yung the region between the arachnoid and the pia mater is a fluid-filled cavity called the cerebrospinal fluid. So everybody, can you take a look at this illustration? So ito yung bone ng ating cranium. Ayan, nakikita niyo yung bone ng ating cranium. Alright, below that is the dura mater. Ito, yung blue. That's the dura mater. Then, below the dura mater is tong arachnoid. Ito, yung may mga linya-linya. Then, below the arachnoid is yung pia mater. Ito, which is directly covering our brain. Ayan, ito yung pia mater. That's the membrane directly on the surface of the brain. Okay, and between the arachnoid and pia mater is a fluid-filled cavity. Ito. So we call this the cerebrospinal cavity with the cerebrospinal fluid. Alright, so here is again the meninges. So ito yung nakaipit, yun yung dura mater, which is directly below the skull or the bone of the cranium. Alright, then below that is the arachnoid, and ito naman yung parang supot na yan covering directly the brain, no, is the pia mater. So between the pia mater and the arachnoid is the cerebrospinal cavity with the cerebrospinal fluid. Ayan, no? So ito yung parang supot na yan, that's the dura mater. Then below that is the arachnoid. Then ito yung directly covering the brain, yung parang manipis na supot na yan directly covering the brain, that's the pia mater. Between the arachnoid and the pia mater is the cerebrospinal fluid. Ayan, ito yung iniipit, yung ini-expose, yun yung dura mater. Okay, yung membrane directly covering the brain, that's the pia mater. So yung between yan is the cerebrospinal fluid. Alright? Okay, so those are the meninges. So again, the dura mater, that's the membrane directly below the bone of the cranium. Alright, then below that, below the dura mater is the arachnoid. The arachnoid contains blood vessels, and there's a cavity filled with the cerebrospinal fluid or CSF. Then below the arachnoid is the pia mater, which directly covers the brain. Ayan, you saw that sa mga photos natin kanina. Right? So those are the meninges. So these are the membranes covering the brain and the spinal cord. Ayan. So ito rin yung bone ng ating cranium. So below that is the dura mater. Ayan, no? Then below that is the arachnoid na may cerebrospinal fluid. And the membrane that covers the brain directly is the pia mater. Alright, so let us now go into the details of our central nervous system. Okay, so our central nervous system or CNS, again like what I mentioned earlier, is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. The general function of the brain is to receive sensory information from the nerves. And once the brain receives sensory information, the brain will process the signals or sensory signals and will initiate a response or initiates responses. So parang siyang ang brain natin parang processor. Once the brain receives information, it processes that information. Ayan, parang processor siya ng computer. Ayan, then after processing the information, it will initiate a response. So that's generally the function of our brain. Alright, while the spinal cord is the principal route for the passage of sensory information to and from the brain. Okay, para siyang kumbaga sa highway, yun yung NLEX or SLEX, no? Principal route for the passage of sensory information to and from the brain. Yan ang ating spinal cord. Okay, so let's talk about first the spinal cord before we tackle the brain. So the spinal cord has two main functions. Right, number one, the spinal cord is the main communication link between the brain and the rest of the body. Alright, so again, like what I mentioned earlier, ang ating spinal cord, kung i-compare natin siya sa parang NLEX yan, di ba? NLEX, it's the main artery, no? Connecting Metro Manila from the northern provinces. Yung SLEX naman opposite, no? It connects Metro Manila from the southern provinces. So ganyan din ang ating spinal cord. No, it is the main communication link between the brain and the rest of the body. It carries thousands of signals at once between the central and peripheral nervous systems. Also, our spinal cord acts as a minor coordinating center responsible for reflex action. So I'm sure you're aware, alam niyo na tong reflex action na to, no? In fact, ang reflex action protects us from potential danger. So, ang spinal cord is a coordinating center, a minor coordinating center for reflex action. So, those are the two major functions of our spinal cord. It is the main communication link between our brain and the rest of the body, and a minor coordinating center for reflex action. So yun ang ating spinal cord. And again, we know that the spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column. Ayan, so here is the vertebral column, and inside is the spinal cord. And in terms of the location of the gray and white matter, the gray matter is inside, the white matter is outside. Ayan, gray matter in, white matter out. Pero sa brain, ang white matter ay in, yung gray matter yung out. Okay, and if you will analyze our spinal cord, there are yung mga nerves that are attached to it, no, for coordination. So may mga cervical nerves, may mga thoracic nerves, lumbar nerves, and sacral nerves. So yung cervical nerves, ilan yan? Hanggang C8. Then yan, C for cervical. Then thoracic nerves, ito T1 hanggang T12. Then lumbar nerves yan, L1 hanggang L5. Alright, then sacral nerves S1 to S5. Alright, so there. And here is a diagram showing reflex action, which is also a function of the spinal cord. Alright, so kunyari ito, no, may kandila, then yan, napaso kayo, yung heat sensation, yung pain sensation will be picked up by pain receptors sa skin natin, no? Then the signals will be delivered by a sensory neuron. The sensory neuron will deliver the signal to the spinal cord kasi di ba parang NLEX yan, papunta dapat yan sa brain. Kaya lang may imminent danger na kasi kung pupunta pa yan sa brain, ipoproseso pa yung information before it elicits a response. So ang ginagawa ng spinal cord, siya na mismo yung nagpoproseso, no? Automatic. So the spinal cord will process the information and will initiate a response, a quick response. Alright, dadaan yung signal dito sa effector nerves or motor nerves to the effector sa mga muscles so that the muscle can contract and will remove the fingers out of danger. Ayan, so yung blue na ito, that's the motor neuron that will deliver the signal from the spinal cord to the effector, yung muscle. Yung red naman, that's the sensory neuron that will deliver the signal from the pain receptor to the spinal cord. So, saka na lang ipoproseso ng brain yun. Kasi dapat matanggal muna yung kamay dun sa heat. Yun ang gagawin ng spinal cord. Parang quick response ka agad siya. Alright, so that's how reflex action work. Alright, ito din, no? So, meron siyang naapakan. Alright, so the pain receptors will deliver will receive the signals and yung mga sensory neurons will deliver the signal to the spinal cord. The spinal cord will quickly process the information and will elicit a quick response. The signals will be delivered to motor neurons, to the effectors para matanggal kagad yung paa, no, out of danger. Alright, so that's reflex action, guys. No? So, bago dapat dadaan yan sa utak pero hindi by the time baka malala na yung sugat. So, it's the spinal cord that will process that information. Ito din natusok siya ng pin. Ayan. So, the skin has pain receptors, ma-receive yan ng mga pain receptors, then the signal is delivered by the sensory neurons to our spinal cord. The spinal cord will process the information and will elicit a quick response. The signals will then go to the motor neurons, to the effector muscles para tanggalin yung pin dun sa skin.